A place where we stake all our hopes on a new beginning, on love, peace, and forever. A moment meant to cleanse us of the past, where every hidden flaw is buried beneath flawless makeup, and every crack in our souls is masked for one brief chance to be seen as perfect by the world. But have you ever asked why that sacred altar sometimes turns into a scaffold that claims a human life? The truth is far more brutal than any fairy tale we dare to believe. What kind of agony would it bring to see a wedding ring, symbol of eternal devotion, slipping from the lifeless hand of an artist, abandoned in a pool of blood on a freezing stone floor? Or to witness a white veil, once meant to shield a blushing bride's eyes, ripped away and repurposed as a shroud for a body that had just whispered its vows? Were these blood-soaked altars the result of cruel coincidence? Or were they a grim sentence for those who dared to seek calm waters in the middle of life's violent storms? Tonight, we reopen the most haunting pages of history. 9 Black celebrities who lost their lives on their wedding day. Listen closely to the echoes of those who fell in the very place that was supposed to be their safest refuge. Zola Taylor, the silent hymn and the fallen ring. Our story begins with Zola Taylor, the lone radiant rose of the legendary Platters. Her voice once floated like a prayer over crowded ballrooms, but fate, ever patient and merciless, had already chosen its hour. At the very moment meant to crown her joy, death stood quietly in the wings, waiting for its cue. It was late afternoon on April 30th, 2007, in Riverside, California. The sky hung low and heavy, stained a deep, bruised purple, like a glass of red wine left untouched at the end of a long celebration. The light shimmered with the same hazy heat that once soaked the summer days of 1960. Zola Taylor stepped out of a gleaming Cadillac Fleetwood, the train of her snow-white silk satin wedding gown whispering across the sun-warmed asphalt. Inside the chapel, hope was alive and breathing. The organ swelled with the tender strains of Only You, weaving through the soft laughter and glowing smiles of friends and family. At the altar stood Lawrence, a local businessman with calm dignity and kind, steady eyes. His hands tightened just slightly, betraying his nerves as he waited. Somewhere in the pews, an elderly aunt whispered a grateful prayer, thanking God that their girl had finally found safe harbor. The room grew hushed as the moment arrived, the sacred pause before the pastor's question. Zola lifted her small, delicate hand as the ring was presented on its silk cushion. The gold barely brushed her skin when destiny struck without mercy. A violent heart attack, born of congestive heart failure and decades of exhaustion, ripped through her like a lightning bolt that could no longer be postponed. Her eyes widened, no longer searching for Lawrence, but fixed on something unseen, as if death itself had stepped out from behind the velvet curtain of life. She collapsed onto the cold stone floor, her slender body folding like a swan struck down at the climax of a love song. The wedding band slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered across the chapel floor, its sharp echo ringing like a final, broken note before vanishing into shadow. Joy shattered instantly. Screams pierced the air. Chaos followed as paramedics rushed in. The pure white veil was gently drawn over Zola's pale face, not for a husband's kiss, but as the final shroud of a magnificent, solitary soul. She closed her eyes at the precise moment she believed happiness was finally hers. Years after her passing, Herb Reed would reveal, through choking sobs, a truth long buried by the industry. He recalled a winter night in New York, 1964, when the Platters stood at the peak of their fame. "She fainted in my arms backstage after The Great Pretender," he said. She was coughing up blood from exhaustion. But the manager pressed a wad of cash into his chest and snarled, "Get her up." The audience didn't pay to see a sick woman. They paid to see a goddess. So they propped her back onto the stage, forcing her to smile, forcing her to sing, while her heart quietly bled out beneath the spotlight. Zola Taylor did not begin dying on her wedding day. She had been dying slowly for decades. The true assassins never needed guns or bullets. It was the cruelty of the entertainment industry and the years she spent enslaved to applause that drained her until not a single drop of oil remained in her fragile flame. Esther Phillips. Esther Phillips. A wedding chalice tainted by death. We stand today on the very ground where, more than 40 years ago, one of the greatest voices the blues ever knew drew her final breath. A woman who spent her life giving melody to the world's sorrow, yet never discovered the tune that could save her own happiness. On August 7, 1984, in Carson, California, Esther Phillips' wedding was meant to be a radiant symphony of joy. The altar overflowed with thousands of pale tea roses and snow-white hydrangeas, a garden of heaven seemingly reserved for a woman who had sung pain into beauty for decades. Laughter echoed through the hall as legendary blues artists lifted crystal glasses, toasting their queen for finally finding someone to lean on. Then, in the thick perfume of flowers and celebration, a piercing scream shattered the air. The music stopped cold, like a tape violently snapped mid-reel. Guests watched in frozen terror as Esther collapsed onto the red carpet. A dark stain spread across her handcrafted lace wedding gown, blooming like a dying dahlia against pure white silk. Was the crown of a diva always cursed? Or had the ghosts of her past waited patiently for this moment of triumph to strike their final blow? The truth behind the velvet curtain of that tragedy surfaced only through the trembling memories of Shirley, the soulmate who had walked beside Esther through her darkest nights. Shirley remembered endless afternoons in suffocating hospital rooms reeking of chemicals, where Esther lay gasping for breath while managers hammered on doors, demanding tour dates. To the predators of the entertainment industry, her broken body was never a life in need of saving. It was merely a worn-out machine, squeezed dry for its last drops of profit. Medical charts spoke of liver and kidney failure, but they barely scratched the surface. The real collapse had begun decades earlier, when record executives shackled her soul with narcotics, turning addiction into a leash. They forced her to perform endlessly, transforming her voice into mortgaged property. In her final days, Esther endured violent spasms, her skin scarred by needle marks, silent testimony to a beauty discarded the moment it could no longer pay. Her despair was not sudden. It smoldered quietly through the humiliating final months of her life. With tears choking her voice, Shirley revealed the handwritten letter Esther had slipped into her pocket just hours before walking down the aisle. The jagged, trembling script read like a last confession, heartbreaking yet strangely relieved. "My dearest Shirley, you know better than anyone. This body is so broken there is no room left for pain. Do not cry for me. Do you smell the white lilies? They are sweet, but beneath their petals, a wooden casket is waiting. Tonight, this wedding dress is not the beginning of a life with Jimmy. It is my final shroud, the only thing I was allowed to choose. Death is my true wedding day, my only way to be free." Esther Phillips' death on her wedding red carpet was the final sob of a soul exhausted at the very doorway of happiness. Is there any cruelty greater than having one's last garment be a white wedding gown? Her passing remains a haunting reminder of the blood price of fame, and of a world that drains its brightest stars until nothing remains but silence. Surrounded by lilies and raised glasses, Esther closed her eyes not because she rejected love, but because the grave had become the only peaceful harbor after a lifetime enslaved to hollow glory. Eddie Kendricks. Eddie Kendricks. A blood-stained ballad laid upon the altar of fate. Our dark journey drifts to 1992, to the silken falsetto that once defined the Temptations. Within walls meant for vows and mercy, destiny waited, not with music, but with something far more sinister, hiding just beyond the light. On the night of October 5th, Birmingham, Alabama breathed under a suffocating heat. The air was unnaturally still, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Towering pine trees clawed at the sky while the moon struggled behind heavy black clouds, draped like a funeral veil poised to fall. Inside the old cathedral, however, another world existed. Hundreds of candles flickered against polished oak pews, bathing the room in gold. Legends of soul gathered quietly, believing they were witnessing the happiest chapter of a long, turbulent life. When Eddie lifted his voice, pure, weightless, almost unearthly, to sing for the woman beside him, time seemed to freeze. His falsetto floated through the sanctuary like a final prayer. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though the storms of fame, exploitation, and betrayal had finally loosened their grip. The king of soul had found his harbor. But happiness, like mist, vanishes the moment you reach for it. As the couple stepped beyond the church doors to thunderous applause and falling confetti, the night answered with violence. Sharp gunshots cracked through the darkness of the parking lot, ripping the joy from the air. Eddie collapsed onto the cold stone steps, his white vest blooming red before the stunned eyes of those who loved him. Music died instantly. Screams replaced celebration. The scent of gunpowder swallowed the cathedral, turning a dream into a nightmare no one would ever forget. According to those closest to him, the terror had been there all along. Otis Williams would later confess, through tears, that behind Eddie's radiant smile lived a man haunted by fear. Old powers that once owned his voice refused to release him. To them, freedom was betrayal. To others, obsession twisted love into possession. A blood-soaked note, found pressed against his heart, read like a prophecy written by fate itself. My love, as the bells ring, I hear a gun being chambered in the Birmingham wind. They are waiting beyond those doors. Do not cry. I would rather fall as a free man in your arms than live another day as a chained commodity. If this moment of belonging costs me everything, I will pay it gladly. And so the question lingers, heavy and unresolved. In a world built on ownership, is freedom so expensive that an artist can only afford it with his final breath, standing at the very edge of happiness? Al Jackson Jr. When the altar turned into an execution chamber of invisible fire. Have you ever wondered what the most terrifying sound on earth truly is? For me, it isn't a gunshot or a scream. It's the shrill, metallic shriek of high voltage tearing through a love song. On the morning of October 1, 1975, Memphis felt scorched alive. The air hung heavy and breathless, thick enough to choke the lungs. Yet inside the Stax Records banquet hall, another reality shimmered into existence. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm amber light. Veteran legends of soul gathered shoulder to shoulder, champagne glasses clinking amid laughter and heartfelt toasts. Draped in immaculate white drapery, the hall glowed with hope. This was the wedding of Al Jackson Jr., the man they called the human metronome of soul music. For the first time, it seemed the drummer who had kept the world in rhythm had finally found peace for his own heart. All eyes followed Al, the sharply dressed groom, radiant as he held his bride close, savoring a happiness long denied. But death, with its cruel and impeccable timing, always strikes when we feel most safe. As Al stepped proudly onto the dais, fingers wrapping around a silver-plated microphone to thank his guests, the unthinkable erupted. There were no words, only a piercing surge of electricity exploding from a faulty device and ripping through his body. In front of a room frozen in horror, Al Jackson Jr. convulsed violently, his frame locking under the suffocating grip of lethal current. The delicate scent of gardenias was instantly overpowered by the bitter stench of burning wires, as the celebration collapsed into chaos, shock, and death. Years later, on a dim afternoon inside an aging Memphis recording studio, legendary bassist Duck Dunn recalled a chilling premonition that had unfolded just hours before the church bells rang. Behind the velvet curtains backstage, a heated confrontation had ignited between Al and his former manager, a man with eyes as cold as tempered steel. Dunn never forgot the way the man gripped Al's shoulder and hissed through clenched teeth, "You think you can walk away from the beat and build a home? This wedding might be the last stage you ever stand on." Al said nothing. His face drained of color, yet his eyes burned with quiet resolve. When the man vanished, Al reached for Dunn's hand. It trembled, though his voice was eerily calm. "Duck, do you see that black car idling at the corner?" he whispered. "It's followed me since I left the studio. If anything happens to me on that podium, promise you'll protect her. I'd rather let electricity burn me alive than crawl back into their iron cage." In Al's scorched breast pocket, investigators later found a small, carefully folded note soaked in smoke and sorrow. It wasn't just a wedding vow, it was a confession from a man exhausted by keeping time for the world while losing the rhythm of his own soul. The trembling words revealed he had sensed his end approaching, felt the cold breath of shadows lurking among the guests. Al did not beg for mercy. Instead, he chose to meet fate head-on, turning death into his final act of love. To fall standing at the altar beside the woman he cherished became the only contract he ever signed willingly, a permanent severance from the chains of the entertainment underworld, allowing his spirit to break free and drift forever with the fading drumbeats of the void. Johnny Ace. Johnny Ace. When a wedding ring lost its rhythm to gunfire, if I can just cross this threshold, maybe every storm will stay behind me. That was the thought Johnny Ace murmured to his own reflection on that doomed night in Houston, 1954. The legendary R&B crooner, whose velvety voice had healed 1,000 broken hearts, stood still before the mirror, slowly straightening his silk tie, searching his own eyes for one last fragment of courage before stepping into forever. He had no way of knowing, or perhaps he did, that waiting behind him was not the glow of stage lights or the promise of married bliss, but the cold, black mouth of a gun hiding in the shadows of fate, patiently prepared to carry out a merciless sentence already written. Outside, the sky hung low and bruised, a cold wind threading through the banquet hall doors like the wail of a restless spirit. Inside, the air was heavy with lilies and wine. Beneath a sheer white veil, the bride stood frozen, fingers clenched around her bouquet, her heart pounding as if it sensed what joy dared not name. At that fragile border where happiness meets death, a shadow had already planned its final, blood-soaked ceremony. 4 weeks, anonymous threats, whispers of a deranged former lover, had stalked Johnny's every step, turning each note he sang into a quiet prayer for survival. Still, when the doors opened and applause swelled, Johnny Ace took his first step down the aisle. Then his smile stopped. A sharp, dry crack split the air. In an instant, a bullet tore through his temple, and Johnny fell at the very threshold of paradise. Chaos erupted. Gus screamed. Music died mid-note. His body collapsed beside the grand piano, frozen in the middle of a love song. Dark blood crept across the red carpet, soaking into fallen white rose petals, a brutal contrast too cruel to forget. His eyes stayed open, locked on his bride, as if even in death he was trying to shield her with one final look. What haunted the witnesses forever was not only the blood, but the small, crumpled paper slipping from Johnny's trembling hand. As his fingers loosened, the note revealed itself, its words colder than steel. This wedding will be your funeral. The night before, Johnny had shown a close friend an old photograph, his bride standing beside a stranger. Scrawled on the back was another promise of death. I will wait for you at the beginning of your happiness to end your life. Curtis Tillman, his brother in spirit and the band's bass player, was the first to reach him after the shot. In rare footage and later interviews, Curtis never hid the shock. He remembered Johnny standing before the mirror that morning for a long, unmoving time, gripping that threatening note like a farewell letter to himself. Johnny wasn't surprised. An old witness would say years later, his voice breaking. He knew the man was coming. He chose to walk out anyway. That night, Johnny Ace stepped forward not in ignorance, but in sacrifice, trading his final breath to silence the ghosts of the past and protect the ones he loved. The warm blood soaking into that death threat became the saddest ballad ever written in black music history. A cost too high for a single moment of freedom before God, and a love story that ended at the sound of a gunshot. Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson, The Poison Chalice and the Last Blues. In 1938, the Mississippi Delta was more than the birthplace of aching blues. It was a burial ground for unspoken bargains and shadowed promises. Inside the choking heat of roadside juke joints, the arrival of Robert Johnson, thin as a whisper, fingers unnaturally long, guitar moaning like a restless spirit, always felt like a warning. That year's small wedding in Greenwood was not his celebration, yet somehow, it revolved around him. Standing on a warped wooden stage, Robert wore a sharp pinstriped suit, lifting a glass of dark, blood-red whiskey with a crooked smile. Toast to the newlyweds, toast to his own restless wandering. But in a land thick with envy and curses, death didn't come roaring through a gun barrel. It crept quietly into the drink trembling in his hand. At the peak of the celebration, as Robert's guitar cried out melodies that seemed dragged from the depths of the earth, his glowing expression twisted in horror. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the floorboards. A sharp, desperate sound that sliced through laughter and song. He collapsed beside the microphone, body writhing in unbearable pain. The room froze. White tablecloths bloomed with spilled wine and sweat, turning a joyful wedding into a silent crime scene before stunned eyes. Shock surged through the hall like live wire. Silver forks clattered from stiffened hands, their echoes ringing through the sudden, clumsy quiet as the music died. In the back of the room, shadowed figures stood motionless, fedoras pulled low. They did not rush forward. They did not speak. They only watched, cold, detached, as if witnessing a debt finally paid. Musicians of the era knew this wasn't simple strychnine born of jealousy. This was foreclosure. The devil, they whispered, had come to collect on a contract signed years earlier at the crossroads. Decades later, the woman who witnessed Robert's final moments still lives quietly in an aging Mississippi house. She has never revealed her name, afraid the devil's shadow still trails those who know too much. Only at dusk does she speak, anonymously, hiding from the ghosts that linger on the edges of memory. Her voice trembles, yet remains painfully clear. That morning, she says, Robert didn't smile. He took my hand, it was ice cold, and whispered, if I can't finish the song tonight, promise you'll run. They've spoken and they won't let us go. I thought it was wetting nerves. But when he lifted that glass from the silver tray, he looked at me differently. Half goodbye. Half freedom. When he fell, the juke joint turned into hell itself. She saw a man dressed in black standing at the doorway. He gave a slight nod, as if a transaction had been completed. After that, Robert Johnson vanished. No headlines. No funeral. No answers. He simply dissolved into the void. In Mississippi that year, death was not always the end. Silence was. Robert Johnson drank the poison cup to settle a blood-bound contract, while the truth of his passing sank beneath the dust of time, leaving behind only ghostly blues melodies, still crying out through the night. Marcia P. Johnson. A name crowned in flowers, now forever tied to an unanswered ending. In the half-lit corridors of New York's past, Marcia P. Johnson is remembered not only as a legend, but as a mystery the city has never solved. Known as the Saint of Christopher Street, she glowed with warmth, laughter, and handmade flower crowns. Yet few saw the shadows trailing behind her, the silent men in dark suits who seemed to follow her steps like a curse. The most devastating moment came on July 6, 1992, when the underground art scene bore witness to what would later feel like a funeral disguised as a wedding. That night, Marcia took her final breath while sealing a union with Robert "Bob" Murphy, a quiet, enigmatic veteran. For a black queer soul who had spent a lifetime pushed to the margins, this ceremony was not just love, it was recognition, refuge, and survival. There was no cathedral, no stained glass or choirs. Instead, the vows were hidden inside an abandoned warehouse near Pier 21, thousands of candles trembling beside the icy Hudson. To Marcia, the river symbolized freedom. In truth, it had already been chosen as her grave. The air was thick with celebration and dread. She stood radiant in a self-sewn white silk gown, a crown of wildflowers resting on her head, looking like a goddess stepping out of a nightmare. As the jazz swelled, she lifted a glass of deep red wine to toast the man she believed was her future. Then her smile faltered. Her gaze locked onto a window behind them. Two men in black suits, motionless, watching. Leaning close, she whispered words that still send chills. The contract has expired. If I don't come back from the river, promise me you won't follow. Moments later, she stepped onto the balcony for air. That was the last time anyone saw Marcia alive in her wedding dress. Minutes passed. Then came a dull, hollow thud, swallowed by the river's rhythm. Inside, a glass shattered. A single white rose fell onto the wooden dais, staining the moment like blood on silk. By morning, her body surfaced in the Hudson. Police rushed to label it suicide, but the bruises shaped like fingers around her neck and the violence etched into her face told another story, one of execution, not despair. Her hands still wore a cheap wedding ring, clutching a wilted wildflower. Proof that even in her final breath, Marcia believed in love. Later revelations from a Netflix documentary and the Anti-Violence Project uncovered a darker truth. She possessed a list of corrupt Harlem officers, and the marriage itself may have been the trap. They didn't just kill a person that night. They silenced a symbol. Marsha P. Johnson died in a wedding gown, touching happiness for only a moment before it was ripped away. Her death left a hollow echo and a brutal warning. No vow is sacred enough to protect you when freedom carries a price written in blood. Marva Lewis. Marva Lewis. When a wedding veil turned into a burial shroud the instant the words, "I do," were spoken. Those two words are meant to be the most sacred promise in a woman's life. Yet for Marva Lewis, a nightclub chanteuse blessed with a hypnotic voice, they became the final sounds she ever uttered on this earth. On a tragic afternoon in 1964, a church glowing with candlelight and fresh blossoms was suddenly transformed into a chamber of horror. At the very moment when love and life were meant to reach their highest triumph, the ceremony unfolded with a grandeur and solemn grace befitting a rising star. Marva stood radiant in a flowing white silk gown, her long veil cascading over her shoulders like a soft morning mist. When the priest posed the ultimate question, she gazed into her groom's eyes, a luminous smile blooming across her face. Her vows were spoken clearly, tenderly, each word heavy with devotion. But as the final syllable faded into the hushed sanctuary, something went terribly wrong. That joyful smile twisted, frozen into a strange and unsettling expression. Before the stunned eyes of hundreds of guests, Marva's body crumpled to the cold stone floor, like a flower cut down at full bloom. A sudden, devastating stroke had claimed her life, right at the altar where she had just vowed forever. Confusion dissolved into terror as frantic attempts to revive her proved futile. Amid the groom's anguished cries and the chaos of grieving relatives, one chilling image seared itself into the memory of everyone present. With nothing else to shield her in the sacred space, the pure white wedding veil, the symbol of innocence and joy, was gently lifted from her head and placed over her still body. No longer an emblem of a bride's happiness, it became a makeshift shroud, concealing the face of a talent extinguished at the very peak of hope. Decades have passed, yet that cursed afternoon in 1964 has never loosened its grip on Dorothy, Marva's sister and closest soul, the one person who truly knew the quiet suffering hidden behind the spotlight. In a dim room cluttered with faded posters and yellowed memories, Dorothy revisits that day with trembling hands, her voice heavy as if time had never moved on. Through tears, she confesses that while the world saw only the dazzling Marva Lewis on stage, she alone witnessed her sister breaking apart behind the colored lights. Dorothy speaks of ruthless nightclub owners who wrung every ounce of strength from Marva, forcing her to sing night after night even as her chest tightened with exhaustion. According to her, Marva endured it all in silence for a single dream: to live one ordinary day as a woman in love beside the man she chose. Dorothy remembers that morning vividly, when Marva squeezed her hand and whispered that the final note of her career had already been sung. Now, she said, it was time to finally live for herself. Closing her eyes, Dorothy's breath falters as she recalls the altar. She says that the instant Marva finished saying, "I do," the most peaceful smile she had ever seen settled upon her sister's face. Then, without warning, that smile vanished, along with the final beat of a heart worn down by years of sacrifice. Marva collapsed like a falling petal, right before her sister's eyes. The most haunting image Dorothy can never erase is what followed: people fumbling in panic as they removed the veil to cover Marva's lifeless body. She shivers remembering how a sudden gust of wind swept through the church, making the delicate fabric flutter and cling to Marva's face, as if her soul were screaming, unwilling to leave just as happiness had finally arrived. Though doctors ruled her death a stroke, Dorothy believes something deeper killed her sister. In her heart, Marva died because the merciless entertainment world had crushed her spirit for far too long, leaving her heart with no strength left to beat for her own joy. Dorothy's pain, and even her identity, has rarely been spoken of, because she chose silence to protect the last trace of her sister's dignity. To her, that wedding veil was never just a bridal ornament. It was the final velvet curtain, falling on a life consumed by fame, right up to its very last breath. Chris Hani. The crack of gunfire cut through what should have been a celebration of love. "Do not be afraid, today is the day victory blooms." Those were the words Chris Hani, the fearless South African revolutionary, whispered to his bride, Limfo Nkosazana, as they stepped through the heavy wooden church doors beneath the bright African sun of the early 1990s, a time when apartheid was collapsing, but violence still lingered in its shadow. Hani could never have known that his unshakable faith in justice would soon seal his fate. His enemies had chosen this moment with cruel precision. They waited until he stood at his most radiant, dressed as a groom, surrounded by hope, community, and applause. The wedding ceremony had just ended. Laughter and cheers filled the churchyard as ribbon-decorated cars lined the path, ready to carry the couple toward their future. Hani gently guided his bride toward the lead vehicle, his hand gripping hers as a silent promise of the life they would build together. Then, in an instant, the future vanished. As his fingers brushed the cold chrome of the car door, a single, thunderous shot ripped through the afternoon air. The bullet tore into Hani's chest, striking him down on the sacred grounds of the church. Panic erupted. His bride's white wedding dress bloomed crimson as warm blood poured from his heart. Amid screams and chaos, Chris Hani collapsed onto the pavement, his eyes desperately searching for his wife's face one final time. No words, only silence. Wedding flowers scattered by the wind fell into pools of blood, crushed beneath the feet of fleeing guests. A place meant to mark the beginning of happiness became a scene of unbearable loss. Yet what made Chris Hani's death truly haunting was not only the gunshot itself, but the shadows that followed. Although Janusz Walus, a far-right extremist, was arrested, rumors spread like wildfire. Insiders and historians whispered of a carefully planned assassination ordered by powerful figures clinging to the dying apartheid regime. Many believed Walus was no lone fanatic, but a hired killer with ties to secret intelligence networks. Suspicion deepened when the police case file mysteriously vanished days later. Some wedding guests claimed they had seen two unidentified men in black suits and dark sunglasses watching from afar, never listed among the attendees. Others within Hani's own movement offered an even darker theory, that traitors from within had turned on him, fearing that love and happiness might soften the resolve of a man too powerful to control. Chris Hani died in his wedding suit, an act of ruthless symbolism that transformed a moment of love into a warning written in blood. We have walked through history's darkest corridors, where the pure white of joy is swallowed by fate's shadow. For these black icons, peace was never guaranteed, and happiness often hovered like a fragile ghost. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, honor them by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications, so we can meet again to uncover more untold stories hidden behind the fame and glory of legendary black figures.